Welcome, everyone. You're in the right place to see an overview of IMAGINiT Clarity Owner Data Portal 2020 with your presenter, Joe Eichenseer. Joe, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jenna, and thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us here, or maybe later on watching this recording, whatever time it happens to be. Appreciate you giving us a little bit of a slice of that. As was mentioned, my name is Joe Eichenseer. I'm the director of our Building Lifecycle Solutions team. As such, I'm the guy that's lucky to be able to work with all of our trainers, consultants, developers, people that have anything to do with buildings, whether it's on the design side or, as more importantly here, we're talking about things on the owner end of things, the facilities management side. Great team of people that we've got that have been building things like the Clarity software and other pieces, here to just try and make your lives a little bit better. And in particular, the reason behind this whole Clarity thing is that we want to make your BIM data more accessible. Make working with Revit, working with BIM, a better experience than it would be otherwise, to break things out of the locks and shells. Now, as we're going through here and talking about all things Clarity Owner Data Portal, also joining us silently in the background on the panel is Peter Costanza, who's a director of our facilities management team. So if you've got any questions, you're welcome to point anything toward him. Yeah, there might be some tech things that we'll wait for the end, but he's kind of hanging out and helping out as we're going and making our way through all of this. So taking that BIM
just
data.
not helping
Peter.
Joe, because I'll defer them all to you, sir.
Fair enough. The idea of BIM data being accessible is most of the time when we're talking about this in the North American world, we're talking about BIM data and we're talking about Revit and trying to do what we can to make that Revit data more available to people that need to get to it, because this is probably some level of reality that you face, that you've got constant distractions. You have just a chaos around you, maybe not every day, but on a pretty regular basis. There's just stuff happening, and with all of the things that you have to do and try to prioritize all of these things that they come to you with a number one priority, and trying to make sense of all that mess, trying to get around to doing something with, we'll say, this BIM data, this Revit data, and try to make it more useful to your organization, it's a problem. Trying to get all those things done in the limited time that we have, limited tools that you might have available, it's difficult, because not only is there all these distractions and things that are going on that are feeding into and working its way through your life, but you've also got people that either don't know or maybe shouldn't know how to get around in the Revit file. Because if we're talking about Revit data and you wanted to see information about a door, room information, location of where you've got a relief valve somewhere inside a room somewhere, if you wanted to find that information from a Revit standpoint, you have to have a computer capable of running Revit. You have to have knowledge of how to get in the software and find things, and that's not going to be everybody. It shouldn't be everybody. It's not realistic. It's not fair to be thinking about it in that way. But we need to still have access to that data. Some of that data might be sitting in whatever type of application you're using for facilities management, but not everything, because not everything deserves to be in your facility management solution. So we're looking to say, how can we extend that? Not replace a work order management system or something along those lines, but what can we do to get this data more accessible? How can we go about using this Clarity system? Of course, we can do that because that's why we're mentioning it here. But what can we do to get things like the DWGs, the AutoCAD files, PDFs, COBie data, other types of data sheets out of your Revit file so that it becomes accessible to everybody instead of it all being locked up inside that RVT file? Those are the types of things that we're looking at from a Clarity standpoint of what can we do to make that data more accessible, make your life a little bit better as you're working with that Revit data and integrating it as best we can into your BIM environment. Now, that takes us to the idea, the concept behind Clarity. When we're talking about Clarity, we'll think of it maybe like a a gatekeeper for data or some sort of a release cycle for things. But the concept is you've got models, Revit files that reflect information and buildings that you have on your campus. Maybe it's just a single building, maybe it's hundreds of buildings. Anywhere in between, small buildings, big buildings, whatever. You've got models. And we need to get that data into a facilities management solution. We need to pull out floor plans, queries, maybe send data out to Kobe so you can take it further into some other application that's sitting out there. But we want to be able to work with that data in different ways. And the intent that we have is to use the Clarity software as a central hub for getting that information where it needs to go. So taking data from your collection of Revit models and extracting all the different floor plan documents that you might want or need may or may not be a part of your traditional documentation set that's stuck in your file management, document management system, because there's plenty of data, again, that's going to be in a Revit file that just doesn't usually get accessed. So how do we get access to those things? Maybe there's a type of roof plan that you don't really get into all the time, so it's not sitting around and up to date inside your traditional repositories. Let's get that data out for pulling reports and queries so that instead of trying to know how to get into Revit or bug somebody who knows how to get into Revit, we can go to a project portal sitting on your hardware behind your firewall, protected as much as you want it to be, but sitting there, and you can just go to that web portal and say, hey, tell me something about my building. Or let's do a query that crosses different buildings and start looking at how things come together there. This is the idea of Clarity. And as much as we can, you'll see a lot of those places are going bidirectional. So we can take the information that we've got and we'll export it out to floor plans, export it out to reports and queries. But maybe there's some places where as we're going to and from a facilities management solution, we want to go both directions with something like an Archibus solution, as an example. Or if we take data in the Clarity world and modify it to some extent, whatever it might happen to be, let's push that information, those data changes, back into the Revit files so that they stay up to date. That's the whole idea of Clarity, is just providing you that easy access, the way to get information to where it needs to go. Now, as we're looking at that, what's it come out? What do these things look like? The reports, the queries, the floor plans, the things along those lines. There's three major pieces that we'll take a look at here, and then we'll get into a live look at the software and the things that we can do in there. We'll see it a few different ways. But focusing in for the moment on data sheets, things about asset information, queries of the models, going through stuff there. The first part, if we're looking at this and how we can get those data sheets and get that asset information through, is one of the tasks, one of the things we do with this Clarity environment is we can take all of the Revit parameter data, the information that resides inside the Revit models, and we pull it out and put it into a SQL database. Once it's in a SQL database, we can start reformatting that data in any number of different ways because it's liberated, it's freed up, so that we can, heck, if you know SQL, you can dive into it on your own and do all sorts of magical, wonderful things, or just using the Clarity interface, we can configure different types of data sheets to say, hey, here's my overall floor plan, highlight the room that I'm looking at, and the critical furniture, fixture, equipment, whatever that happens to be in that room, at least according to what the Revit model said should have been there when we finished design, when we finished construction, whatever. Go through and maybe use an HTML editor to reconfigure what that data sheet looks like so that we can show that information in a different way. How do you want to report data back to your users, to your stakeholders, however you want to phrase it into there, but to the people that need to have access to that information? It's all a matter of just how do you want that report form to look, and then turn it around and say, not only can we do this with, we'll say, rooms and reporting what's going on inside the rooms, but, what are we, 20-something different categories of object types in Revit that we can report on. So not only rooms or spaces or mechanical equipment. If you needed to, we could go so far as to say, even let's create a data sheet for furniture, a spec sheet for furniture that says, here's the data we have about a particular chair. And all of this is coming from Revit. In this clarity world, we will treat Revit as the source of truth. Once we have the data here, do you need it to go into your facility system, or is this just a nice informational piece that we're not tracking and we're not logging as formally as it would be inside your facility solution, but it's good information to have, to know what it looks like, to get a picture of the actual chair or equipment or whatever sitting inside that data sheet location, or just what it looks like in Revit, just so like a computer representation of it. Whatever it might happen to be, showing that information, reporting it so people can understand what's going on inside my model based off of BIM, based off of Revit. So a lot of things we can do from that data sheet standpoint. They're all based off of HTML templates. So using an editor that exists inside Clarity, we can do whatever you want to with those reports, with those data sheets, within the confines of what's possible within HTML. It's all as a web portal inside your firewall running on your servers. So there's one thing here we have then that is the idea of data sheets. If we go a little bit further, a little bit different, there's other types of reports that we can pull back, just different types of graphical reports that don't have as much configuration possible inside them as we're looking at some of the data sheets or other types of tabular reports that we might get, but they'll be a lot easier to start pulling through. It's the idea of what do I want to show? And based off of that, the more graphical type of report here, a little bit more of what you see is what you get, but it's a lot easier. You just go click, click, and there's the defaults. If you want more than the defaults, great. Let's go configure it, customize it, whatever word you'd like to choose in there for making it better and different from what you saw before. In this case, we're looking at a floor plan view of that same level of the building. And in this case, we're coloring all of the room objects according to the floor material that is inside that room according to Revit. So in Revit, everything purple in there had a VCT, vinyl ceramic tile, sitting through all of the floors. The dark brown is some sort of a raised tile. The light green, just raw cement. And then the darker green at a carpet. If we had carpet 1, carpet 2, carpet 3, carpet 4 in different grades or colors or whatever carpet, then in Revit, we would have the rooms saying, oh, I'm CPT1, I'm CPT2, or however you choose to define it. And the colors here would adjust accordingly based off of looking at Revit as that source of truth, what's really happening inside there. And then the table down below, like a little spreadsheet or a schedule inside Revit, reporting on that same information. We have the ability to color code things inside those reports, the red that you see in that base finish column, where we can flag something to say, to highlight, to jump out at you, because in this case, it's missing information. So we set up a rule for this particular report that said, if this is empty, highlight it in red because that's an omission. It's an error that we need to fill out and we need to fix. There are workflows that we can use whereby you could fill in that information inside the Clarity environment, submit it back to Revit as a requested change. Somebody in Revit with Revit knowledge, a Revit user, model manager, whatever title, they would receive an email that there's a requested change, open the model, review the data changes. If the data changes are good, hit an approve button and let all that information come on back and update inside the Revit file. Or obviously, if we can approve, that also means we can reject it, give a quick reason why, and let an email go back to the requesting person that says, this was rejected, here's the reason why. But we can initiate that change process through this Clarity environment if that's something you want to do. If you don't want that, then you just leave that feature turned off and we just use it as the reporting tool, whatever is most appropriate for you, for your organization, the way you want to run it. In this case, we're looking at rooms inside a particular floor plan. We can also take that same level of the building, and this happens to be looking at a door report. This door report has all the dots that represent the doors in the building, and we're coloring them according to what, in technical Revit world, is what family of door is it. In common terminology, we might say, what type of door is it? We've got some things in here that are barn doors. We've got glass doors, curtain wall doors, solid core, single flush. There's all sorts of different door types that, again, are color-coded here for us, representing all the different things that are happening. In the Revit world, we'd call it a door family just from that internal usage name. In practical world, call it whatever you need it to be, so the people that are receiving and looking at and understanding this information, well, they do understand it. Color the doors according to fire rating. I was talking to somebody recently where we wanted to give a report and color the doors according to a property that they had set up of marking whether the door was exterior or interior. And they had a particular property inside their doors that was just a checkbox, yes, no thing of, is this interior, is this exterior? And we were using these reports to quickly identify where do we still have to fill out that particular piece of information because it's not correct. Because everything that was an exterior door was going to be blue and everything that was interior red. So we've got an easy color separation just at a glance to know what's where. And in their case, that was good identification. We then turn around, go to Revit, and make that change directly in Revit. That was the workflow that worked for them. Didn't have to do any editing from the Clarity side, but if that was something where they wanted to go to that in the future, it's available to them. But that just doesn't work for them today. It's all about the data, opening it up, making it available to people. From beyond just using the data, if we want to start working at getting that data out to other applications, beyond just the fact that it exists in SQL and we can start working with it there, we'll also have the ability to do things like, here's the settings that we've got for exporting your building data to a COBie spreadsheet, a COBie formatted spreadsheet. What things do we want this to be? In this case, the file name with the document inside brackets. Clarity sees that document inside square brackets code as a special variable that says, make it my Revit file name. So if your Revit file name was main administration building, the resulting Excel spreadsheet would be main administration building.xls, XLSX in this particular case. But taking data and putting it into that COBie formatted spreadsheet so that, presumably the idea is we'll take that COBie spreadsheet and import that data into anything that can accept a COBie format. Beyond just COBie, if we're looking at this from how do we get it to that database to begin with, we've got some different types of settings through here of how much data do we want to pull out of Revit and put into our SQL database. How many files? Do you want data from all the files, or is it not worth it and we'll skip the structure file because it's not like we're going to be changing any of the structure? How often do you want to go through and refresh the information that's sitting inside your database? Anytime somebody touches the Revit file and hits Sync to Central, do you want it to update the database? We can do that. Do you want it to update on the 1st and 15th of the month, every Friday, every day of the week at 2 a.m. if the Revit file has changed? All those things are possible. It's a matter of just identifying how frequent do you want Clarity to refresh things. Similar types of settings exist out there if you wanted to update your PDF set for sheets that exist from the Revit file. All sorts of things that are possible of making working with Revit, or at least working with Revit data, better and easier than it would be before. All of the reports that we've been looking at so far, the graphical reports, the data sheets, all these things that we've been looking at have been focusing on one building at a time. And as we're looking at a building, that might be the most common way that you'll be interacting with Clarity, perhaps. Starting with the most recent version of Clarity, Clarity 2020, which is just released last month, we have the ability to start building in a query that reaches across multiple buildings. And when we're looking at those multiple buildings, we can build up queries that are saying, well, hey, show me something. So we've got a query here of, what toilets exist in which building? We'll look at some of these. What types of mechanical equipment do we have in which buildings? There's an interesting little family search of where do I have a certain type of duplex outlet if you needed to. All those things exist now, and we can start querying across multiple multiple buildings to see what's the collection of things we have in my campus as a whole. Now, as we do that, there's a little bit of setup. We'll take a look at this. We need to identify at some point in time what are the things that you do care about. In the Revit world, there's some curious things where if I were to go through and establish a part number for a piece of equipment or anything through there, as I'm setting up that part number, in Revit you can say, well, is the part number a number field? Is it an integer? Is it a numeral? Is it a text field? There's different ways that you can say what type of data is it. And in Revit, Revit doesn't care. It can merge things together, does all sorts of happy things. But as soon as you take it to SQL, SQL cares a lot. There's a big difference between a field that's a real integer and something that's a text field. And so that they'll be conflicting from time to time. So one of the things we have to do is as we're extracting information, each building gets its own database of information. And as we're doing these cross-building queries, we need to go through and say, hey, here's the stuff that I care about, and we're going to base it off of building X. Hopefully there's a lot of consistency that you're working through. And I know I'm getting in the weeds. I apologize for that well, maybe it's good stuff. Either way. But as we're doing this, we're building a query that says, based off of one building as a template, I want to grab all of this data and we'll assemble it into an index. And then we'll start querying based off those indexes of what's happening across the entire building. We'll take a look at that pretty soon here. Beyond just the flat 2D graphics that we've got, the text tabular type of information that we'll have in these cross-building queries or something here, we'll also have the ability to get a 3D model that we can navigate in the web page. So not only am I able to see just a floor plan, a traditional construction document view, whatever, I can also, in the Clarity web portal, start navigating around the building so I get a better 3D understanding of what's my space look like? What's the second level of that building look like? How do things come together? Maybe if it's a mechanical room or something like that, where is a particular piece of equipment in that room? And we'll be able to see it from that three-dimensional standpoint. Some cool things there. Be able to see properties of those objects as we're going along. One of the final things that we'll talk about here before we start getting into a little bit more of a live presentation is the idea of quality of data. And I'm not talking about it from we'll say a data validation standpoint of, is the part number really 3 letters, a dash, 2 numbers, a dash, and 3 letters, or whatever through there. In this case, when we're talking about quality of data, I'm talking about the quality of your Revit files. Are the Revit files that are coming in, meeting within acceptable standards? What's the health of those Revit files? One of the things that we've been able to do with Clarity for a little while is to pull out pieces of data about your Revit files, metadata, things about like you see here, the warnings. How many warnings exist inside your Revit file? Some number of warnings might be okay, but where's that threshold of bad warnings? Maybe we also want to qualify those warnings as being high, medium, or low severity. How many imported objects do I have? That would be assigned to you of how much AutoCAD did people put into this Revit building. Is there a lot of CAD? Are there a lot of imported elements, or are there very few imported elements, and you've got a lot of native Revit geometry? I'm not saying that one specifically is good and the other is specifically bad, but it gives you context to know what it is that you're dealing with as you start working with the data and the Revit files. If there's a lot of imported geometry, there's going to be less data inside your Revit file, because there really isn't a whole lot of data that comes with it. It's a line on a layer. It doesn't tell you much. There's no embedded data there. We had one of our customers out west ask for us to qualify how many 3D views are inside my Revit files. And they were using that as a piece of information to identify where in the overall design process was this particular building. If they're receiving files and they've got just a lot of 3D views, we're in the earlier design stages where we're looking at things in 3D, evaluating the design of the building. If there were not so many 3D views, that project has legitimately moved on to later stages of design development or construction documentation, whatever it might happen to be. There's all sorts of things that are out there. Over 60 different pieces of information that we can extract about the Revit file that you can utilize. You won't use them all, but for the ones that matter, let's grab it and go. And then if you need to, we can flag things as saying 20 warnings is okay, 50 is not. So we can set up some metrics based off of what's important to you that says if I've got up to 20 warnings, give this file a green dot. If it's between 20 and 50, give it a yellow. I'm not happy, but let's keep an eye on it. If it's more than 50, give it a red dot so that we know this is something that either internal people that know something about Revit, or turn it back over to the person that supplied you the model to begin with and say, hey, you've got too many warnings in here. Let's resolve some of these things to make it better. So setting up those types of color coding to understand what's happening inside your Revit file. The clarity side of things does a lot, whether we're talking about this type of metrics or data about your Revit file, reporting on information of the data that's inside the Revit file, producing PDFs and DWGs and IFC files and all those things. Clarity does a lot, but it's inevitably going to have something that you wish Clarity could do in Revit for you that's just not there. Well, in Revit itself, there is a programming language that they've got called Dynamo. It's a visual scripting language, creates diagrams or graphs like what you see on the left-hand side. And it's an automation tool that exists inside Revit. Now, Clarity has the ability to take a script or a graph that you've created, or maybe somebody created for you or whatever, and batch process that graph, that script, across any number of different Revit files, any number of different buildings. This becomes important because as we're talking to other organizations, there's going to be the desire to configure things, to tweak it. We've got some smart people that can do these extra things. Is there an API for Clarity to do other things beyond what it does out of the box? There is a formal API, but then there's also this integration with Dynamo where this becomes your gateway to further customization of that Clarity environment. So there's plenty of ways we can take it beyond the way it installs, the way we work with you to configure it and integrate it into your environment. There's always that option to take it further on your own. You're not limited by just us. Now, that being said, if you've got something that you're thinking about putting into a Dynamo script or whatever to have Clarity batch process across all your files, we'd certainly appreciate knowing that this is a gap that you envision within the Clarity environment so that maybe we can just take that piece off your hands and integrate it into the Clarity software. There's all sorts of possibilities of what can happen, but you've always got that personal ability to go through and customize it further. This Dynamo basically becomes your pathway for creating your own custom tasks and automated procedures. Now, what would you want to use Dynamo for? There's any number of things possible. What is probably an easier way to look at it is to examine what types of things Clarity can do natively, and then from there turn around and say, well, what else is left? What else might you want to do that's not a part of this? A lot of different tasks we have for exporting or sending something out of a Revit file. We talked about PDFs, DWGs, IFC files, Kobe, as mentioned, the data sheets, Navisworks files if you're going in that direction. A lot of different things where we can produce from the Revit file. We'll also have, excuse me, some different places where we're talking about the data. I've talked about the data a whole lot, whether we're talking about pulling things into the SQL database or there's an Autodesk extension called Model Review, which can help check for standards inside your Revit file. Does it have the proper Revit parameters built into the file? We can check that. You build the check using the Model Review extension, and then Clarity can batch run that check across any number of different files, any number of different times, checking for the performance and those metrics that I was talking about of how well is this Revit file put together. Different ways to exchange data. Some of these are maybe a little bit more relevant for, we'll say, a design team that's working together and constantly passing files back and forth as you're going through that earlier design and documentation process. You may or may not be a direct part of that, depends on what your internal workflow looks like, but all sorts of ways that Clarity can help with publishing, cleaning, and sending files out to other people, and then when they send them to you, maybe receiving that file, cleaning it up before it deposits the file in the appropriate folder on your file server. All sorts of possibilities sitting through there. Beyond that, if we go a little bit further, Autodesk has this grand world of their cloud, the Autodesk Cloud, BIM 360, collaboration for Revit, all sorts of names that are being used by their service. We can work, Clarity can work with that Autodesk Cloud environment so that if you happen to have a project that's sitting up in BIM 360 design, and so you don't need to transfer everything back and forth like that previous slide said. It's all done. It's there. Fine. That's great. So we can have Clarity work with that data. So we're constantly taking the data and the files that are sitting in the Autodesk BIM 360 environment and either creating local backup copies of it, extracting the data like we were talking about. All the things that we have can be done whether the files are sitting locally in your network or up in the Autodesk Cloud. If you happen to have something that's sitting up in SharePoint, we've got that. Change tracking, taking a snapshot of a file on a regular basis and then comparing those snapshots to say what's different, what's been done for all of these different elements. Viewing the file and the native browser that I had mentioned before, both the homegrown viewer that we'll tend to use more often or taking it into and using Autodesk Forge. There might be some costs associated with that because you're now utilizing Autodesk servers, but it's sitting there. Things to help out with IT management, for backing up projects, backing up the Clarity aspect of things. Doing some analysis of the families. So what families do you have in your approved Revit content library? And then what families are actually being used inside the Revit projects? Where do they match? Where do they not match? How are they comparing to each other? And then, as we mentioned before with Dynamo, the ability to create your own custom tasks. There's an API available for Clarity if you wanted to do something formally with .NET, or use Dynamo, use it integrated with Revit itself. All of those things being possible and open to you for taking Clarity to that next level. So that's a bunch of background information. If we want to take it to a live look at things, I'm going to go over here. I've got two different tabs open up. It happens to be Google Chrome right now, looking at two different servers, looking at things in a little bit of a different way. When you first log into your project server, you'll see something that looks a little bit like this. A grid of cards that are showing you all of the different types of projects of buildings that you've got access to. If you want to get into details about an individual building, you click on that building and start looking at its data. So I'll click on this LaGrange building. It'll start saying, hey, yeah, this is a Revit file. It happens to be version 2018. If I wanted to look at a report of what's happening inside there, I'll go over to the left-hand side and choose on my reports button. It'll give me a list of all the reports that I've had generated over time for this particular model. If I wanted to look at, I don't know, we'll say the doors. This will be similar to one of those slides that we saw inside the PowerPoint a minute ago. But here's a report of all the different types of doors, the door families in a Revit terminology, that exist inside this building. If I click my button called Show Diagram, it'll give me that floor plan view with all the dots that tell me where those doors are. Come up and choose, well, how do I want to see things? Well, let's highlight by fire rating. And all of my rated doors, well, maybe I don't have any in this building right now, because if I look at my legend down here in the bottom left-hand corner, the yellow dots are places where the fire rating is set to a triple dash, so undefined. The red dots are going to be places where there's just nothing. It's completely blank. It's the equivalent mathematically of calling it a null set. There's not a space. There's just nothing. So looking at this, I can see that a lot of the doors, somebody went through and put a triple dash. That doesn't do me any good. But it does give me the information to say, let's come back and talk to the design team, to the data entry team, however you're working, and get the data into the system the way it ought to be. Instead of fire rating, if we were to look at, we'll say that family name, here's the collection of different door families that are being used inside my building. And we can just identify them quickly and graphically by color. Hide the diagram, and we're back to where we used to be. That's the idea of these different reports, of being able to see and understand the data in different ways. Come down and choose a report here for room contents. Inside room contents, this would be a place where we say, well, here's room 100, room 101, room 1172, whatever we might have. And as we're looking at that particular room, what things exist inside that room. So it's taking a little bit longer. I'm not sure why. I might jump over and be impatient and look at building number 2 just for kicks and giggles. As we're looking at this one, it's roughly the same building, but we've got all those marks. If I jumped over and to look at data sheets, the data sheets are the ones that are built off of those HTML templates, where if I'm looking at a room data sheet, the default room data sheet that we ship out of Clarity looks kind of like this. It's like a template that you might get in Autodesk Revit. They give you a title block, and that's great, but you make your own. A similar type of thing here. This is an idea of what is possible, but you'll want to go through and create your own. And this is all the information related to room 100, which is that room in the corner of my building, all the things that exist in that room. I've got 4 different Revit files that assemble together to make this building. This is reading through the links and everything else to identify what exact items exist in this room. I've got lighting fixtures, lighting devices that are coming from an MEP file, air terminals from an MEP file, electrical fixtures that might be in the MEP or the architecture file. The fire extinguisher cabinet is definitely going to be from the architecture file. What doors are coming through here? What types of furniture do we have through here? All of this information coming from that particular item. Now, this is all based off of that HTML template, and room images are coming from that. So I can also, inside Clarity, go through and say, instead of that basic room image, do a screen cap of that room from my Revit file so that I can see equipment, I can see dimensions, all sorts of extra things inside that building. If I wanted to completely reconfigure things, I can come in and choose a different type of room data sheet that's just looking at it in an entirely different way. So I'm seeing things in just a reconfigured, printable one-pager about that particular room. Or if I wanted to look at this and say, show me information about my furniture, I'll have a data sheet that's showing me data about my furniture. An ever so exciting picture of a file cabinet, and that's just the Revit preview graphic of that file cabinet. If I wanted to see a chair, I'll be able to see information about the chair. In this case, the graphic that we chose to throw into the data sheet is one that's saying, here's what the chair looks like in Revit. If you wanted to swap that out with a manufacturer's image, or you walk out there and take a picture of your own, that's no problem. We could swap it out with any other image that you might choose. That's one thing that we have for this particular data sheet. And telling you, according to Revit, what rooms does that chair sit in, or mechanical equipment, or whatever we might happen to have. And it's all sitting out there waiting for us to look at things. We had mentioned the data about the Revit file. I'll come down and look at this area called Model Metrics. I'm not going to harp on this too much, but if I'm looking at this from a Revit file standpoint, even if I'm a Clarity user and I don't know anything about Revit, there's an inherent knowledge that green is good, yellow is warning, red is bad. If I trust the people that in my organization that set up the rules inside Revit, inside Clarity, I'll know that, hey, the architecture file has got some stuff it's got to work on. The site file, not so bad. MEP file, not so bad. Structure, not so bad. It's really the architecture. There's some red dots everywhere except for MEP. No, even MEP. Sorry, I forgot that one right there. It's 53 views, not on sheets. I don't like that. Let's clean it up so we're not dealing with unnecessary data. There shouldn't be any views that are not on sheets at this point in Prime the Model, if that's your point of view. But we'll be able to see that. We'll be able to look at graphs so that we can understand over time in your Revit file, how is something like all the different elements in here. This is our list of 60-plus different things we can pull through. The file open time. How is the file open time for my Revit file adjusting? And are my computers working well enough for my staff to be doing some of that in between design work in Revit? Or if I wanted to look at this and say, across my entire, click on metrics way up here, my entire server with everything that we've got going on, how are all my files comparing? What's the collection of file sizes that I've got from a Revit end? And there's the whole smattering things that I've got through here. The biggest file that I've got in this list on my server here happens to be 294 megs. The smallest file is probably right here, 4. So I've got a huge range of different files. Is it bad? We're not trying to make a judgment call on this necessarily, but if you know that your computers in Office can't handle the really big files that you sometimes get from a provider, well, this is a quick way to understand, am I in a danger spot? Or if something is red, the overall file size is increasing over that period of time. So, hey, let's keep an eye on those things if it's growing too much too fast. We can start comparing different elements together. In the area here called firm standards is where we get to set up those rules that make the red, green, and yellow dots. It's completely configurable by you to know what are the things that you care about. What gets a green dot, what gets a yellow dot, and what gets a red dot. All information about the file, so that not only from just a pure Revit data for helping to manage a facility, but also Revit data that helps you manage the Revit file itself. Because that's almost inevitable. If I flash back to the other server we've got here, it took a little bit to come up for whatever reason, but the same type of thing. We had that room contents report, and all of this is where we were looking at that individual file. One of the things I mentioned early on in the presentation here was the idea that we now have the ability to query across multiple buildings. Well, to do that, I'm going to go ahead and click on that IMAGINiT Clarity logo up here, which takes me to that home page, for lack of better words, that has all of my files on it. And if I wanted to look at something that was something across multiple buildings, what's happening through here, in the upper left-hand corner, I'll choose this button called a building query. And like I said before, there's a little bit of setup that you do, but once it's in place, if I wanted to know family usage across projects, I'll go ahead and click on this particular cross-building query and say I want to look at the BossMed project, C4R test, a sample project. I'm going to look at the LaGrange project. Oops, don't want some of those in KFA office. I want to compare those files. I don't want to look at everything. I want to look at this subset of files. When I hit the select button, it's going to go through here and say, hey, what families are used across all of those projects? And what this report is telling me, I don't have a single family, a single piece of Revit content that is used in every single one of those buildings. That could be throwing off some major red flags for you, or it could be something where you're saying, that's interesting. Well, let's look at something else. But this is what families are shared across all of your projects. Personally, I might be a little bit concerned about that because ideally, you've got the same types of content that are used across all of your different buildings, and that's telling me that I don't have anything that's common across those buildings. That's, from a data management standpoint, that's good information to have because it's, alarming might be overstating it, but it's worrisome. Let's try that. So let's say a family search. I'm going to look through, we'll say, the LaGrange project and the advanced sample and the Audubon higher ed. I'm going to grab that. And the family name that I'm going to look for, let's just look for a duplex outlet, just for something so we can see it show up for us. And through here it says, look for DUP in your family names across all those buildings. And it says, hey, that LaGrange project has these different electrical items that are duplex, and that Audubon higher ed has that one. The other files that I picked had nothing that were duplex outlets. So they either don't have that data in the Revit file, or they were named something different so that they're not showing up through here. But that starts to show me what the information is across all those buildings. Yeah, I haven't clicked this one before, the toilets by building, but I'll go ahead and do that. And let's say we're going to look at Audubon higher ed and LaGrange. Just keep two. That'll be pretty darn similar. Hit that and say OK, and the Audubon building is all using this toilet type, and there's 9 of them. The LaGrange project has that same toilet, 16 in that one, and it's also got this flush valve wall-mounted item. There's 14 in it. So we're starting to be able to build out and see what's happening across our entire portfolio of Revit data. Now, you do have that concern over, is the Revit data trustworthy? So we've got to worry and think about those types of things, but that's the idea that we've got in this Revit environment of what do we see, what's happening. In the case of these cross-building queries, what do I have that's common across whatever collection of buildings that I want to look at, and then utilize that information into something that you can take action on. and move from that point forward. So a lot of different types of possibilities that exist for us. I had mentioned that this particular feature, the cross-building query, and it wasn't completely new for Clarity 2020, but it's dramatically improved. All we could do before was just query across and see what types of rooms were common in some different buildings. Now it's much more robust than it was before. So the question might come through and say, well, what else has been enhanced for that Clarity 2020 version? Well, the list of things that we've got inside Clarity 2020 that are taken some level of enhancement is through here. Now, if you've never seen Clarity before, none of this makes a difference. But if you are somebody that's watching this now, seeing a recording later that has seen a version of Clarity somewhere in the past, it's a high-level idea of what types of things were touched, added, enhanced, whatever, in this latest version of Clarity. It's all about data. It's all about access to data, querying things, reviewing information. If you want to, making edits to data through the Clarity environment, but taking that information and doing something with it, whether or not you know anything about Revit. The whole idea of this, as I mentioned just a moment ago, though, is based off the idea, the requirement that the data you have is good. This could be a tool that helps you identify where your data is not good so you can go about the process of fixing it. It can be a place where, if you know the data is trustworthy, that you could start using it to identify information about your buildings, about your portfolio, so that you can better manage things and understand what's going on. Take data and move it from one facility application to another. It would be a clearinghouse, whatever it might happen to be. But as we're doing that, this is really a component of that overall building BIM implementation that you might be going through, of moving from CAD to Revit, moving into this concept, this idea of BIM. If you're doing that and we're working through it and trying to make things better, make sure you're asking yourself some different questions as you're collecting this data to make sure it is trustworthy. As you know, if you have a little piece of data and starts, maybe just not one, but a couple pieces, and then maybe a few more pieces, whatever, and you start running into data that's inconsistent or not trustworthy, people will have a tendency to discard the whole system. So we want it to be as reliable as possible for the sake of getting work done, but for also the sake of people trusting and working with this. Knowing what you need is based off of who's going to use the data. When you know who's going to use the data, be it Clarity or whatever other tool, the Revit data that's in there, then we need to know what information do those people need. How are you going to acquire it? Are you going to just do a data dump from Revit through Clarity into SQL and then use the Clarity environment to update all the information? Are you going to have an army of people or an army of one go into the Revit files and start manipulating the data directly? Are you going to require that any of your service providers fill in the appropriate information as it's coming in? Who's responsible for it? How is it going to be collected? If it's existing data, how are you going to send people out to the field to collect the data and bring it back? Once you have that data, who's going to maintain it? If you don't know who's going to maintain it, maybe start back up at the top of this list and say, who are the people that need it? Are they the ones that are going to maintain it? If you can't find anybody that's going to commit to maintaining the data, don't bother collecting it, because very soon it will be out of date. It goes into that list of things that are not trustworthy and starts having that negative impact on your entire system as a whole. So we've been promoting these 3 questions for years now, and they're still valid. They're still important. And these are just still a piece of that overall BIM implementation. When we're looking at that, Clarity can be a piece. Answering these questions can be a piece. There's a piece of software and services associated with it, a piece to this that IMAGINiT has called BIM Switch that can help out with the process of how do you go about collecting data and incorporating it into a model. There's all sorts of things. The whole idea behind it is let's make sure we're looking at things comprehensively. These are pieces to it, critical, important pieces, but there are pieces. let's work together to get you to a better place. Clarity is a wonderful tool to help you out with that. Let's see where it comes to next. With that being said, we've got a few minutes here left for any Q&A that might have been hopping around in the panels as I've been talking here.
Sure. One moment while I end today's recording.